Welcome to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif on Rogers TV here in Barrie. And Mike, this one I'm actually really excited for. It's a little bit different from something we've done in the past. Obviously, we're here to talk about real estate, the market, how it impacts you at home. But in this particular case, I strongly suggest if you're at home, grab a pen, grab a tablet, take some notes, because this is not just going to be about the real estate transaction itself. Yes, it will include that. But also, for those of you who have no plans on going anywhere, we've got a great, phenomenal, useful show for you about maintaining your home and keeping it in great shape. And we've got a phenomenal guest with us today. I want to welcome Jeff Disher, who's the owner, operator of PuroClean Restoration right here in Barrie. Jeff, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, guys. Happy to be here.
Great.
So let's get ready. Give us a little bit of background, because for those of us, I'm sure many of us are familiar seeing your vehicles and sort of signage going around town, but aside from driving slowly past properties wondering what's going on, what's actually going on when you get the call, and really where are you bringing value into the marketplace here?
Well, to tell you the truth, we get involved in properties when somebody has some type of property damage at their property, resulting from water or fire or mold growth, biohazard removal, anything to do with property damage. That's our main focus.
Yeah, and a lot of times it could be as a result of an actual incident, a fire, a storm, tornado, whatever, but many times it's something that sneaks into a property and may go unnoticed. Maybe we can talk a little bit about your discovery, and it can act as a heads up for the homeowner out there on what they should be watching for.
Absolutely. I mean, most of the times in the situation that you're talking about, it comes down to maintenance of a property and more lack thereof maintenance. So people find these maintenance issues that have gone untouched for many, many years or months. And at that point, it's become a major problem, and they're calling in a company like us to have a look at the issue and give them some good, solid advice on what needs to happen in order to get the property back to a pre-loss condition.
So one of the things that we can take for granted, we buy a new home, there's a new subdivision, we assume we're moving into a what could be wrong situation. Now, some of us have been around long enough and they know that they're taking notes at 30 days or on move-in, and a year later for having a discussion with the developer or the builder later on for some, some touch-ups, so to speak.
Yes. Warranty items.
New homes don't necessarily come sort of perfect, and nothing against any one particular builder. Sometimes it's environmental, sometimes what can happen with a new home?
Really anything can happen with a new home. I've been in brand new houses that have had floods, not necessarily from a cosmetic issue, but maybe there was a problem with a trade that came in and didn't secure a plumbing line properly, and the homeowner moves in, they start putting use on the house and pressure on the house, and before you know it, there's a leak and a flood happening in a brand new house, which is not what anyone moving into a brand new house wants to have happen, but it does happen, and that's why it's super important to call in a proper restoration company so we can get in there and dry things up and make sure that there is no risk for any type of bacterial growth or mold growth down the road.
And again, the assumption that it's a brand new home, nothing should be wrong. Drive by a subdivision that's under development, and oftentimes as it's partially complete, that roof will be one of the last things they put on. So water's getting in there and it's settling in and everything else. So even after the home is complete, there could still be water sitting in there waiting to do its damage.
To grow into mold eventually. Exactly. I mean, that's the inevitable truth of it, is you get water, if it's not handled properly, it turns into mold growth, and we've done mold remediations on brand new houses.
And what's typically I'd say the top 3-4 places are scenarios where mold is coming into the house? What are the things that are happening in the house?
Well, I mean, a pipe leak would probably be the number one hit. Anywhere where you have a water supply, so in a kitchen, a bathroom, your hose bib going to outside. Usually it's scenarios where it's enclosed, where you don't physically see the pipe, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, and a small leak is happening within a wall cavity or in a crawl space.
Freezing because you didn't shut off that valve to the outside.
The hose bib, And I mean, by time you find those trap scenarios, it's already bad, and it's not it's not something that can be dried out at that time. It's something that needs to be remediated and then repaired.
Yeah, it usually comes to the attention of the owner either through an inspection or just odor or something, but the damage is already done often.
Or your increased water bill, even for that matter, depending on what type of a leak scenario it is.
Absolutely,
true.
Absolutely.
True.
Now let's talk about things. We'll stay on the topic of water. There are other things that you look for and other areas that you assist. We also touched on new homes. Certainly a home can settle over time, or if you're in the first phase of a multi-phase development, you've got compactors going down the street, they can upset some of the structure, etc. We've talked about those things. What about scenarios where you're inheriting generationally? Like many of our homes, certainly in the cities, could have been built in the 50s, some before that are turn of the century homes. Any sort of common themes that you find with homes that may have passed on from generation that may have gone through a renovation or not?
Well, some things, when you talk about a generational home, asbestos is a big thing that comes to topic for me. Especially homes that were built prior to 1986. A lot of people don't know that there was over 2,500 building materials used between the late 50s and 1986 that contained asbestos.
Wow.
So, I mean, when you're getting into a generational home, most people are looking to do a renovation at that point. And it's when you're looking at doing that renovation that you could disturb those asbestos fibers within the materials. So, I mean,
as long as it's dormant, it's good. But as soon as you start upsetting it, cutting into it and everything, you're putting it into the air.
You're putting it into the air, and that's the concern, is the airborne asbestos dust. So, I mean, really by law, anytime a contractor is doing a renovation, they're supposed to be performing what's called a DSS survey, a designated substance survey, which would outline where there are any asbestos-containing materials within a property.
Some insulation, the blown-in insulation did contain traces of
vermiculite
asbestos.
insulation contained asbestos, caulking contained asbestos, drywall compound, drywall, ceiling texture, floor tiles. Long list
all the
of
things I worked
right?
with before I came into real estate.
And most people didn't realize. So, I mean, for the small amount of cost that an asbestos test is, you're better to do the testing and find out what's in your house, just so that all parties can be safe.
So the house doesn't need to be torn down if it contains asbestos, but
it's a good thing to know what you have in your house. You don't need to remove it. It's definitely not a hazard on its own. It's the disturbance that creates the hazard. So most people do it by need.
Do you see many incidents in our region of the, urea formaldehyde that was an insulation product?
Not many.
It wasn't used for very long.
I can tell you in the last year, I think I've had one call for urea formaldehyde.
Which is an insulation.
Which is a spray foam insulation back in the beginning days of the spray foam. That's what they used, was urea formaldehyde. Those products have changed significantly since then, and there's not much remaining out there in the industry. We don't see it that often.
So let's talk about air quality. You've obviously sort of made that transition, and we'll get back to some of the water concerns and some of the famous hot spots we started to touch on, but let's continue on with air quality. We're not talking about a sale, we're not talking about doing a transaction at this point. We're talking about people who are quite happy living where they're living. However, some of the symptoms or signs that we see are obvious. There's a water damage, there's a leak on the floor, something's going on. Some of them are a little bit more silent, but they're environmental and they can create illness. And
oftentimes that is the indicator. You have a child who's got symptoms and you're trying to figure out what it is. It's environmental a lot of times.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about some of that. What are some of the manifestations or some of the sources of whether it's respiratory illness or things like that? What are some things that people could be looking for that just to, again, beware?
Well, when it comes to respiratory illness and air quality, really what you're coming down to is, and I come back to the same topic, is mold growth. Symptoms for somebody who might be experiencing something related to mold growth or water damage would be like allergy-like symptoms. Mold affects every person differently. There's no one set. If you have these symptoms, you're affected by mold. I can be in a moldy scenario quite regularly and it doesn't affect me, where my business partner, who has some minor respiratory issues on his own, goes into a site and he can't be in there too long without starting to cough and hack and needs to get out to some fresh air. So Generally, if you're experiencing those symptoms, what we recommend is that you vacate the space, get to a spot of fresh air.
Yeah.
If the symptoms seem to go away when you're in the fresh air, not in that environment, then it's a pretty good indicator that that environment has some type of a air quality issue. At the end of the day, to really determine whether or not there is air quality issue, you would have air quality sampling done within the property. Those air samples would be drawn into a pump, and then the cassettes get sent down to a lab, and they actually analyze the cassettes, and they can tell you what is in the air in your home and what levels they're at, so they can determine whether or not it's an acceptable amount of microbial growth within the air compared to a control sample taken from maybe another room or outside. Because there is an acceptable amount of mold growth. I mean, you can go into any property, even a brand new property, and do an air sample, and you're going to find some mold growth within that
From
sample.
person to person, that level of tolerance varies.
The level of tolerance is different. Obviously, it's more impactful on younger children, and older people are more susceptible to those types of conditions than kind of somebody in that mid-range, but either way, it's still not a good scenario to be involved with.
So let's just sort of, I don't want to say wrap up on air quality, but what are some of the things that you're seeing sort of in the last decade or so that have been introduced to homes? Obviously, we're not necessarily talking about the destruction of an entire home. Sometimes there are add-ons that you can do, air exchangers, any type of filtration systems, things like that that you might recommend for people?
Absolutely. There are whole home HEPA filter units that can be put onto a furnace, or even running an air cleaner within the house that has a HEPA filter. That's going to be the key, is the HEPA filter. So a HEPA filter is the only filter that will filter down small enough to capture any type of a mold spore. Anything else, the spore will just go right through the filter. So having one of those units installed in your home can really help scrub the air in the home and exchange the air in the home through that filter. That's going to improve the air quality greatly within a home. Those filters are something that we use similarly when we do remediations to capture the mold spores in the air. So
excellent. Mike, you want to take us to break and maybe give Jeff a thought to think about while we go to break and come back?
Well, just with regards to the air quality and that, I was going to suggest you're talking about scrubbing and everything else. Older air conditioners were at one time, maybe they still are, a source for mold. And if you recall, I don't know if you remember the term Legionnaire's disease. They discovered throughout legions, they couldn't figure out where it was coming from. And in school portables, people were getting sick, and they traced it back to mold that was accumulating within the air conditioning systems in some of these older buildings. But so you never know where the source is going to be, I guess.
You don't.
Is my point.
If there's water, there's a possibility for mold.
Exactly.
So.
Good place to take us to break.
And with that, we will go to break. Awesome. I'm learning a lot. I'm loving it. And as we said, we're talking with Jeff Disher, who is the owner-operator of PuroClean Restoration, about not only how to prep your house for sale or what to look for when you buy, but actually, while you're living there, how do you ensure a healthy environment? We'll be right back with more from Jeff Disher right after this break. Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we're joined by Jeff Disher, who's the owner-operator of PuroClean Restoration in Barrie. Awesome to have you on, learning so much. First segment, we really touched on some challenges or some opportunities that people who are currently in home ownership, enjoying their home, but want to explore maybe the cause of some environmental challenges, or how to respond, or how to be a little bit preventative and proactive about home maintenance. Fantastic stuff. But let's actually get into now preparing the home or dealing with sort of your end of the spectrum when it comes to a transaction, the sale of a home, the purchase of a home, and what are some of the things that people should really be taking into consideration. Now, I think when we talked kind of before the show, you often are dealing with the homeowner itself, not necessarily as a result of a home inspector. But what are some scenarios that you come in when there's an actual transaction happening?
Well, a lot of times we're getting calls in from either the homeowner directly or the real estate agent on behalf of the homeowner.
Right.
9 times out of 10, what has happened is a home inspector has gone in and done a home inspection at a property, and they've found some deficiencies within the property outlined in their home inspection. Usually we're getting that call in to look at those deficiencies and help provide some pricing and some direction on getting the deficiencies taken care of for the sale of the home. So.
Attending home inspections with the home inspector umpteen times over 20-something years, oftentimes where there is a water and potential mold issue, it's not visible. Sometimes it's just a feel of the moisture, sometimes it's a smell.
Correct.
But even without that, there can still be an issue. Tell us some of the testing techniques that you do, that a home inspector will do, that are going to be red flags to reveal that there may be mold issues.
Well, generally what we do when we do an inspection is we use several different types of instruments. So we will use a thermal hygrometer, which is going to measure moisture, both penetratively and non-penetratively. Into materials. We also use thermal imaging cameras to do inspections of closed surfaces. So it could outline a temperature difference within a wall cavity where there may be some missing insulation. It could indicate that there is some water issues in a certain area, which would let us use our thermal hygrometers to actually physically check those areas to see.
It'll verify
that it's wet.
Yeah, what the infrared camera will kind of hint towards. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, most people have an inconception about a thermal camera that it's going to show you where the water is, and it doesn't.
Missing insulation.
It shows you temperature indifference. So the theory is that wet material is cooler than dry material is warmer. So it kind of is that first step to say, hey, listen, there's a cool spot here. Maybe I should get my other meter and check to see, is it physically wet?
If it's more of a probe?
It's more of a probe or just kind of a plate sensor where it'll read the surface up to an inch deep and let you know if those materials are wet. Generally with trapped moisture, that could be the reason why you're getting an odor or a smell in a basement that could be musty. You have some trapped water behind a drywall surface or a finished surface that you don't know is there, and it's turned into some bacterial growth, and that's where the odor is coming from.
Now, are we typically, just for that homeowner who may be dealing with this, in every scenario, is there going to be reconstruction required because you have to go in and take things apart to get to the source, or is it only when there's mold, or do you have to take apart to reveal the mold? Tell us how that goes.
That's a great question. I mean, if it's a fresh water leak,
it just started yesterday. Yeah.
We do have the capability to structurally dry houses without removing material.
Okay.
We are trained to do that. Then that is where we would like to be in the market, is structurally drying. If it's a long-term kind of maintenance-related leak, foundation seepage through your foundation, a window has been leaking for a long amount of time, and it might just look like to a homeowner like some paint's peeling, but there's actually kind of more going on behind the wall than they know. Those are things where you would need to open it up and then do some minor repairs on the backside. But
so me just going in with my shop vac after the laundry tub sink has leaked and thinking I've cleaned everything up and I'm done and that's it, is that a good idea or not?
Well, it's a great idea to clean up the water, absolutely.
Is that the be-all, end-all?
That's not the final step.
Yeah.
The key is making sure that it is dry. If you want to prevent mold in your property, you need to make sure that the materials are dry.
The different layers of flooring.
The different layers of flooring, the insulation behind the drywall, those things need to be dried right away. Usually we kind of give ourselves a 72-hour window from when a leak happens to get things dried up. Anything kind of beyond the 72-hour window, it kind of changes, the category of water, and then you start looking at having to remove materials as opposed to drying them.
So over the generations or over the decades, housing construction has evolved. You can talk about field
Devolved or evolved?
Well, that's a good question, Mike. But stone foundation to cinder block foundation to poured concrete to ICF, all these different types of things to make homes. I mean, there's a goal of energy efficiency, et cetera. I don't know if one's bad and one's good from your research, but there's also things that come into consideration around circulation. So you could have ground seepage. Some homes have sand floors, sand basements and crawl spaces.
Yes.
So in terms of ensuring water quality and air quality, do you need to excavate your home and pour a different foundation, or does circulation sometimes assist with a healthy environment?
Well, I mean, for me, in my opinion, and everyone's going to have their own opinion, around a foundation, you need to make sure that the outside is sealed. At the end of the day, that's the bottom line. You know, when you look at how housing construction has changed over the years, and you know, older century homes, we were talking before the show with fieldstone foundations, and then you have block and concrete. Whether it's ICF or traditional, at the end of the day, the water's trying to get in, and you need that barrier on the outside to prevent that water from coming in.
And it's also what's leading to the barrier. How is the home sloped?
Correct.
Are your gutters taking the water away from the foundation?
Correct. Water is the enemy at the end of the day when it comes to a house, so you want to be directing and controlling that water from the outside in. You know, people will spend thousands and thousands of dollars on their kitchens and on their beautiful floors, but really where the money should be spent is on that building envelope to ensure that water is not coming into the home, and protecting all of those nice finishes on the inside is going to be the key. Right?
And in our climate, you know, concrete as it dries and ages, it can get a small crack.
Correct.
That's not the end of it, the small crack. In our Canadian environment with the freeze-thaw cycles, a little bit of moisture in that crack freezes, it expands, and over time that little crack becomes the big crack.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we flirted with the idea about talking about where you come into the mix when there's a transaction involved. I think we went on a bit of a tangent, which is exciting for those at home who are wondering, wait, you didn't cover this? Well, we're going to cover it. We got a little bit more time on the show. But let's talk about the actual transaction. You know, you sometimes are representing the seller. You sometimes are being called in after the fact when something is revealed.
Correct.
Talk about some of the scenarios, though, where one, you can assist a seller with having meeting a successful transaction on their perspective.
Yes.
Also in terms of disclosure when it comes to the buyer, when the buyer's got that flag.
Well, I would say 90% of the time when we're involved in a home sale, it's related to mold growth in an attic. It's not a space that anyone goes into on a regular basis, and it always gets revealed. So usually what will happen when we get called in is we're getting called in at the last minute. People have to sign back to a seller's agent. They have a limited amount of time, and we get called in. We need a pricing right away. Can you come out and have a look at what's going on here? We will go out, do an inspection, provide a quote with recommendations on what needs to happen depending on what the specific issue is that's outlined. And then the real estate agent and the seller will typically use either that as a bargaining tool within the sale, or we will get called in to do the work as part of the sale. It's written in the documents. And then, like you said, sometimes we do get involved after the fact. I won't hear anything from the agent or the homeowner for a while, but then I end up hearing from the buyer, and they end up having my quote, and they want to go ahead after the fact to get the work completed on their own afterwards. So, I mean, we kind of work on both sides, not one more than the other. But that's typically how we get involved in the transaction. Some sellers are proactive in having us come out and just do a general inspection of the house to kind of maybe help outline some concerns that they may have that are already there, that they already know are concerns, and they want to kind of get looked after before they go into that home sale transaction. Part of it. That way there isn't any red flags for a home inspector, and that's where I'd really like to see a homeowner be, is calling us out before you know that you're going to list your house, so that you can deal with those issues before you even go to list, so that they're non-issues. Right?
Do you happen to know, through your experience, does the standard homeowner insurance policy cover most of the issues that you come up against?
A lot of water damage issues are covered. Anytime you see mold growth, the insurance companies tend to frown away from covering the mold growth, because they'll look at it like it's a long-term maintenance issue.
Right.
So because it does take time for mold to grow, it's not instantaneous, and typically they won't cover it.
See it as neglect,
Yeah, so I mean, they will cover most losses as if they were water, but as soon as mold gets in, they don't want anything to do with the mold.
We'll pick up on some of insurance elements and things to look out for when we come back after the break in just a moment. But in terms of readying the home for sale, and what have you noticed, and maybe Mike as well, you in your experience in the transaction itself and representing both buyers and sellers, coming to market saying, here's my listing, here's the phenomenal virtual tour, here's the emotional stuff that you're going to fall in love with about this property, and oh, by the way, this house was just certified as free from mold, great air quality, here's the report that you can add as a supplement, those types of things. Does that ever happen, and why or why not?
You know what, typically we don't see any reports like that, as part of a home sale. That's a fantastic idea.
Oh, you can talk to me afterwards. Absolutely.
Well,
and it would be great to have a documentation like that for a seller to have to put within a home deal, saying that they have had a company like ours.
It would have to be mandatory if we were going to see it. If there's a cost involved, it's typically left until it's absolutely needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. People don't want to spend the money to do it. It would be fantastic to have something like that where you could go in and do a thorough inspection and say that this has been looked at, and we can certify that there's no water leakage.
Hey, I'm just going to argue this, Jeff.
Right?
I'm going to say if you're living in well and septic, you're going to have part of your disclosure being the fact that the well was tested, the water was tested, all those kinds of things. I think if it's a competitive market and a seller wants to, is up against some competitive inventory in the market there, it may have to be mandatory for it to be part of a requirement of the transaction, but I think it's still a great feature on the part of the seller.
If you want to stand out, when you're in competition, I think it's great proactive advice for any home seller for sure.
Well, absolutely, especially when you're looking at a new build scenario.
Yeah.
I mean, there could be a lot you could do in a new build scenario during the building stage that could help prevent stuff from happening down the road that you could look at putting a certification on.
When we come back from the break, sorry about that, Mike, but when we come back from the break, we're going to continue on the conversation. I don't know if you had something pending in the back of your mind there, but let's cover some different types of properties and how that may add a different dynamic to the work that you do or to the impact that it has with buyers and sellers or homeowners in general. So we'll talk about different property types, but we'll also talk about something that I found really fascinating, and that is the different types of categories of water and how that plays a role in your safety of your air and water quality in the home, your environment in the home. So we got to go to break, but when we come back, don't hold your breath. We'll have more from Jeff Disher, owner-operator, PuroClean Restoration Barrie. Stay with us. Don't go anywhere.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we have Jeff Disher here from PuroClean Restoration. We're having a great conversation with, I'm learning a lot, I know you're learning a lot, and I think our producer's learning a lot in the booth. He's taking notes too, and we're talking about various scenarios where your service are called into play with regards to mold. Oftentimes, and some of the various things. We'll come to that a little bit later, some of the other scenarios. But let's talk a little bit further about some of the other structures. We talked about detached homes where a lot of your services are called into play. But there's other places you're called out to, perhaps condominiums. Talk a little bit about that, where a condo owner or a condo corporation may be calling in your services.
Absolutely, yeah. We deal with condominium corporations and apartment buildings on a regular, and not necessarily just apartments. There are townhouse condominium complexes that we get involved with, and they have their own share of difficulties for a company like ours. Having that many kind of units condensed in a condominium building can create havoc over multiple units. So it's not like you're just dealing with one structure like a detached home. You could have a flood that creates damage in 10 units as opposed to just dealing with
pipe leaking
with
three stories up. That just
absolutely. And I mean the biggest thing for me is in a condo unit is that as an owner of a condo unit, you carry what you would think of as homeowners insurance. But really, in that scenario, you're having a condo insurance, which usually would cover unit improvements on your specific unit, and it would also cover your contents within the unit. So what happens in that scenario is that a certain percentage of the liability is on the actual condominium corporation.
Yeah. The contents, I believe, are part of the personal policy of the condo owner.
Of the condo owner,
it's the structure itself.
So it would be your condominium insurance would cover contents, and it would cover unit improvements to the unit.
Okay.
So however those units within that condominium complex were sold originally would kind of be like what they call a standard definition unit. So if your unit was sold originally with carpet and small baseboard, that's the standard unit. If since that creation of that unit, you've gone in and put in tile, and you've upgraded the baseboard, and you've put in a better kitchen, all of these things would fall under that homeowner specific policy.
That's on you, yeah.
Right? So the standard definition unit is what the condominium corporation's insurance company goes off of. Once you get to that standard definition, then your policy jumps into effect at that point to cover the difference. Where the problem can be is that each condominium corporation has a different standard definition unit. So unless you know specifics about what their standard definition unit looks like, how do you know how much coverage to have on your condominium?
It's within that status certificate when you purchase. So good advice to
and that's one of the interesting things is that we go through the process and we're excited. We're buying our first home, or maybe we're downsizing, et cetera. We found the perfect unit. And the neat thing is, anybody who's ever had the experience of going through purchasing a condominium will know, especially if you're buying from a builder, there's the 40 to 60 page document that outlines what's included and what's not included. And
Rules
usually
and
there's a yellow highlighter where you're supposed to sign, and there's a whole bunch of Latin, Greek, or legalese in between, maybe outlining when your deposits are due. But there's also the standard charge terms and the condo certificate that oftentimes, status certificate that oftentimes the legal representative is reading, and may or may not be under some pressure to sort of move the transaction along depending on your level of enthusiasm to read all of the fine print. I don't know how many times you've received a credit card in the mail and it came with the booklet that went straight in the recycling bin. But what you're describing is something that's actually really fascinating that you sort of shed some light on before the show when we were talking. And that is, most people look at their condo as there's my unit that goes up to the walls, and then there's the common elements, but we don't always have the fine details figured out. And you actually have a scenario that was pretty fascinating where you notice that there's a bit of a gap or a discrepancy between who's covered for what and who's left hanging when, and maybe you can shed some light on that.
Absolutely. So recently I've had a client who experienced a flood in their condo.
Right.
And what
it's a multi-unit?
Multi-unit condo, 4-story condo in Innisfil.
Okay.
They had a standard condominium policy that was written for $30,000 in coverage. What he found out after he had the flood, when he reached out to the condominium corporation and his insurance company, is that the condominiums, the standard definition unit for the condominium specific to where he was they cover up to drywall, installed and ready for paint, and that is all.
Yeah.
So if the worst case scenario happened, which is how you have to look at it with the insurance, if the building burnt to the ground and it was to be rebuilt, the condominium corporation's policy would cover to have an empty unit, drywalled and ready for paint, and that is all.
Nothing
so
inside.
his $30,000 now has to replace all the flooring, all the kitchen cabinets, all the fixtures, all the vanities, all the tubs, all the painting, all the trim and doors. So $30,000 is definitely not enough. It's not going to do it. So he realized that he was far underinsured, and my direction to him was, you need to go back to your broker and increase your policy.
Supplementary policy.
Yeah, and get more limit on your policy, because if that worst case scenario did happen, you would be left stranded.
Yeah.
Right?
Water's one scenario with condos. Odor migration's another thing you see is quite common, where you have units side by side, above and below.
Correct.
And they're not perfectly sealed units. So you have, well, go into details on where you may see that scenario.
Well,
Make your phone ring.
In a condo is a perfect scenario for that. really, or even a townhouse, a linked townhouse, a whole bunch of linked townhouses. What we see majority of the time is smoke odor migration. People smoking in units, and somebody 3 or 4 units down can smell it. I can tell when they're smoking down there. It smells like smoke in my unit. Even if somebody has had water damage and they're not dealing with it, and you have that musty smell, that can transfer through units. I mean, you don't see it in detached houses.
Cooking smell sometimes.
Or cooking smell. Maybe somebody likes Indian food a lot, and that smell is not. So do I, and that smell is coming through, and maybe that other person does not like the smell of Indian food. So I mean, you run into those scenarios in condos. There are control measures that we can use and put in place, during the remediation to kind of prevent those from happening. So.
To a certain degree, though, that's almost a buyer beware. You know you're moving into a congregate setting. You know that there's a crack under the door leading out to the hallway. Stuff is going to do there. But another scenario that's really quite interesting, maybe you can touch on, is, and first of all, I mean, we recently, not too far back in recent history, there was an apartment fire in a multi-unit in the Upper Allendale sort of area of Barrie, and that was a considerable fire.
Yes.
Now that was a rental scenario, but landlord coverage of insurance and structure is still in place in a landlord-tenant relationship, and content insurance is still in place in a tenant scenario there. But the interesting thing is, when you are displaced, is also a cost that you might find. So if somebody accidentally lights their apartment unit on fire from careless smoking, or a cat pulled the curtains down into the whatever.
Yeah. Or a mold hazard even.
Or a mold hazard. You could be out, in some cases, several years, and some things to talk about and check out. You might not have a leg to stand on if you try and argue that you thought you were insured. You might, that's a different story, but what are things that you need to look at and talk about with your insurer to make sure that you are covered? And I'll throw a little add-on to that. When there's more than one decision maker involved in the mix, you're coming into the mix, but it's not the homeowner necessarily. There's the homeowner or the occupant of the dwelling, and then there's somebody else in the mix with their insurance and their policies.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, most policies, and I can't speak for every policy because every policy is specific, but what I see on my end is most policies have what they call alternate living ALE coverage, alternate living expense, which would, as a tenant, if you had a flood or any type of property damage in where you were living, that portion of the policy would come into play that would allow you to have somewhere else to live while a restoration company like myself came in and were actually working on the property on behalf of the building owner.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, but that would be your personal policy over and above the condo. Like the condo corporation's policy is not going to be
so the condo's policy would only cover direct damage to the condominium itself, the building. Your tenant policy or condo policy would cover the pack out and the removal of your contents from that unit in order to be able to physically do the work. It would cover alternate living expense, whether it be a place to stay or food. You need to get food. You don't have a kitchen. You can't cook anymore. You got to go out and eat at a restaurant. Things that you might need in a fire scenario, like toothbrushes and clothing, because people don't think about that when a fire happens. Everyone always wants to go in and I just want to grab some stuff. Well, you take that to another location and it reeks like fire. So you're not really going to want to take anything out from a fire. Most people don't know soot is a carcinogen. So.
And if there's an investigation, you may not be able to touch any of those things for a period of time.
Absolutely, and that's usually the scenario on almost every fire. The first couple of days, our engineers, the fire inspectors are coming in for cause and loss to determine exactly what happened, not to mention if there's any actual structural issues from the fire.
Right.
I mean, obviously, it's just a hazard being in a fire situation, just with the soot. Like I said a minute ago, soot is a carcinogen. When it mixes with moisture, it forms a low level a low pH acid. So you don't want to be breathing in any of the soot from a fire, because it's super bad for your lungs. So,
Okay, we're going to have to go to break in a second. We're I mean, we got so much, we're going to have you back. But when we come back from the break in just a minute, let's touch on that other thing I want to talk about, which was I found really fascinating, the 3 different categories of water. Sure. We did touch on fire damage, and of course, when the fire is, sometimes they're just pumping water, sometimes they're using a chemical additive as well, foam, or they call ABC type of different responses to fire. So you talked about carcinogens, etc. We could also talk about cleaning the air, and you've got some technology available to you that sort of is better than what was used before when it came to cleaning the air. So maybe we could touch on that. But I'm enjoying this. There's still so much to learn. So we're going to talk about maybe even a wild scenario that you came across that I think would be very interesting for both tenants, but also the homeowner if you're in a landlord-tenant relationship.
Sure, you've got some stories.
I'm sure you've seen some things. So when we come back from the break, just a little bit more to wrap up with Jeff Disher, who is the owner-operator of PuroClean Restoration in Barrie. Stay with us. Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we've got Jeff Disher, owner-operator of PuroClean. Jeff, over the last few segments, we've been talking about some commonalities, certainly some differences in home ownership, structure, differences in building types, etc. But one of the nature of occupancy that is very common in many municipalities is that landlord-tenant relationship. And we should talk about that in terms of where does responsibility fall when it comes to the tenant, where does responsibility fall when it comes to the landlord?
Well, most of the time, the responsibility falls on the landlord. So they're in a contractual obligation with the tenant to make sure that the property is maintained and safe for them to occupy. Whether that means, the traditional working smoke alarms, CO2 detectors, but where we see the biggest issue between landlord tenants is the maintenance thing. The maintenance piece is a big one.
Leaky toilets.
Leaky toilet. My toilet's running. My faucet isn't working. My drain is leaking under the kitchen sink. Is always a big one. And a lot of those things kind of just get pushed to the side by the landlords. They don't necessarily get addressed in the
Sometimes the tenant themselves just lets it go. It's not my place.
In a timely fashion, or like you said, the tenant doesn't notify the landlord. I mean, I shouldn't be so hard on the landlords. A lot of times they are unaware that there's problems going on at their house, and they would be more than happy to have them addressed.
It'd probably save them a bunch of money if it's not a stage 4 category, type of an issue.
Absolutely, right? So, I mean, really, it has to be kind of a team effort between the landlord and the tenant to make sure that the property is being looked after, meaning that when a problem is arising for a tenant, the best thing you can do is reach out to the landlord and get that looked after. If the landlord isn't responding to what you have going on, reach out to a company like us, and we can come out and we can at least have a look at it and inform you on what needs to happen in order to get it rectified. That way you have that documentation. You can go back to the landlord and be like, listen, I had somebody come and look at it already. You're not responding. This is what needs to happen.
And by the way, you're going to reimburse me.
And by the way, you're going to reimburse me. Or it might not even get to that point. The tenant may not have the funding to be able to do any of that stuff, but at least they're setting it up for the landlord to make it easy for them to just say, yeah, go ahead and send me the bill. I mean, that happens to us all the time.
Very good advice. And you've been doing this now 12 years, is it?
I've been doing this almost 13 years in the kind of the insurance business.
Right.
I've been in construction over 20 years. So I mean, between the two, I've seen a fair amount of
which was the lead into the question. So. You must have some great stories, some interesting, maybe funny, maybe scary, but any come to mind things you'd want to share with for entertainment, if nothing else?
Specific stories. I was actually at a property.
Don't have to give names.
Last week. That was a landlord-tenant scenario. The landlord ended up having to force evict out their tenants.
On what grounds?
Well, they had, for one, the landlord was looking to get in to just do regular maintenance inspections.
Yeah.
Which
they're obligated to do.
The tenant wouldn't let them in.
Bit of a flag there.
Bit of a flag. So why are you not letting me in? So how he ended up getting in was a safety thing. He had to go in and look at the smoke detectors,
Yes.
and when they got in there, they were very kind of dodgy about where he could go and whatnot. He ends up going down into the basement to check the furnace, and it's dark and there's no lights on, and can you please turn on the light? They give him this little tiny light. He ends up bumping into something that startled him, turns around, and there's a huge, massive grow-op operation in the basement. So, I
It's
mean,
a revenue generating property now.
well, it is for the tenant.
Yeah. Even with changes in the law, this is still taking place in residential properties.
This is still taking place, and now, if anything, it's probably taking place more now than most people realize. People are able to get licenses for the growing of marijuana, and
So this is a bit of the kicker, though. Get into some of that, because from what I remember, you were saying that actually the tenant had a license to what?
They had a license to produce plants and grow plants.
But it wasn't their property.
But because it wasn't their property, it wasn't disclosed to the owner of the property or the mortgage holder on the property, which definitively the response would have been, no, you're not allowed to do that in there.
This is a standard charge term and standard in pretty much every single mortgage and or insurance contract, unless otherwise a separate rider is put on the property. You are not growing any plants. You're not turning this into a greenhouse or grow operation.
And absolutely, the moisture from a grow up like that is humongous. You know, the homeowner is in this scenario is looking at about over $100,000 in repairs to the property just to rectify what's going on in the property from the tenant. And it's sad to see, because it's something that could have been very preventable at the end of the day.
So they're going to have to go in there, they're going to have to do their inspection, they're going to have to tear that place apart, and I've seen this, reveal any surface that may have mold.
And disclose it on the title.
And disclose it, and then they have to have the inspector come in from the municipality to green light the fact that all of these things have been done.
Absolutely.
And at the end of the day, it's quite an expense. Landlord's not collecting rent during that period of time. And now you have a stigmatized property because it should be revealed by when that property is sold that this has taken place in the property.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
So it'll be interesting. Now, of course, there's the residual elements. Even once you clean it all out, there is cleaning the air. Traditionally speaking, we talked about this before, there are different methods of cleaning the air, recycling the air. I think you talked about an ozonator before the show, but you've got some different interesting technology that you use. I'll ask you to talk about both that air cleaning technology as well as the fact that some people have this fear that if I'm going to bring in a restoration company, man, they're coming swinging and they're cutting everything down. What are you doing at PuroClean that's a little bit different from that, or maybe significantly different than that?
Well, what stands out for us and how we stand out in the business, for one, is our customer service-based approach. We do have technology, that is kind of industry-wide, but it does kind of set us apart a little bit. There is ozone generators that can be used for odor kind of in a house. They're very harmful to human consumption, so we tend to kind of avoid using those products.
Tell us a bit about what you do use in its place there. I found that interesting.
So in its place, we use what's called a hydroxyl generator. Right. And basically what a hydroxyl generator does is it's replicating a naturally occurring process that happens outside from the sun. The sun creates UV rays, and the UV mixes with the particles in the air, which creates that fresh smell that you smell. You go outside, breathe the fresh air in. It's directly as a result of the hydroxyl radicals that are created by the UV from the sun. We recreate that process within a house using a machine with UV light, and it helps to eliminate odor within a house, whether it's from water damage, mold, whatever, smoke, odor, cigarettes. Those are the kind of processes. We also don't just use those exclusively. They're used in combination as kind of like a system where you would use air scrubbers to scrub particulate from air, and a lot of detailed cleaning.
Dehumidifiers, blowers.
Dehumidifiers, air movers. Our biggest thing is we want to restore your property. We're not, back in the day, everyone was called a rip and tear contractor.
Like Mike Holmes coming in there,
it got wet,
down to the bare
you
bones.
ripped it all out, it all needs to be replaced. I mean, we've learned over the years now through science and technology that materials don't need to be removed in order to restore them back to a pre-loss condition. And it's very hard to get that through to a homeowner who doesn't know. But once they become educated, usually their tune changes a little bit. I had a scenario where. A gentleman had a flood, his insurance contractor came in, they wanted to rip and tear everything out. We came in after the fact and we're very much in board with structurally drying, which is the direction he went. Saved the insurance company thousands of dollars, saved the homeowner tons of disturbance. So, I mean, that's our goal at the end of the day.
So, quick question, we are coming to the end of our time with you. I'm sure we could have a lot more conversation around this. Some ideas in terms of prevention. I mean, I'm not asking to give away the trade secrets necessarily, but what's a message that you can send out to homeowners and tenants alike, occupants of a home, on how to avoid some expensive costs? We also could talk about if you're going away on vacation, how do you ensure that you're coming back to a safe scenario?
It all leads to the same thing. It comes down to maintenance at the end of the day. So routine inspections of the property need to be taken, whether it's walking around and checking your foundation to make sure that there's no cracking going on underneath any water supply fixture, sink, tub, toilet. Check your lines, your supply lines, make sure that they're in good shape. They don't last forever. It's not something that people think about on a regular basis. The water supply that goes to my toilet, very common element that breaks. I almost recommend to people that they change them out every 3 to 5 years, just because they do deteriorate.
Things dry out.
They dry out, things get weak, they can burst. As far as going away from the property, my general rule of thumb in most insurance companies will dictate that you need to have someone at the property doing a check every 3 days at minimum to make sure that there's nothing going on. My recommendation is that if you're going away, 2-3 days and longer, you're going down to your main water supply in your basement and you're turning it off. And you're opening all of your fixtures in your house, your sinks, and letting the pressure out of the lines. That way, if there ever was a problem,
you're a snowbird and you're going to be gone for some time. That's not extreme.
You shut it off, you drain the pressure out of the lines, and then there's no possibility of a burst while you're gone.
Very
because
good advice.
We do see that happen quite often.
Advice for the realtor?
You got less than 60 for advice for the realtors.
Advice for the realtors, I mean, if you're really in a sales scenario, call in a restoration company. Most of us offer free inspections within kind of the greater city area.
Preliminary,
We can probably spearhead some of the issues that you guys have going on, just so that way when you have a home inspection come in, it can be kind of a smoother process.
Right, good to know. Thank you.
Well, excellent. Jeff, I mean, listen, love having you on. Thanks for coming in. Certainly we covered some of the transaction, but we also covered for the thousands and tens of thousands of people who aren't exactly in a sales scenario right now, but how can we ensure a safe environment that will serve us for a long time? Any parting words before we head out?
If you guys have property damage at your place, we are the paramedics of property damage.
Ooh, I like that.
Feel free to reach out to us. There's no question too small, no problem too large.
Perfect.
We're here to help. So
great information.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
And with that, we hope you found that useful. We hope you found that enjoyable, informative. Feel free to email your comments to us or whatever. I know we've taken a lot of notes. And I can also assure you that a guest coming up in the not too distant future is also going to cover some other sides of the equation on home inspection in general. And I think it'll be a great tie-in, so you won't want to miss that either. But in the meantime, Jeff, we wish you the very best. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time
Jeff.
on Hitting Home.
Thank you.
Take care.